All right. My name is Chris Sanford. I work at the Twin Oaks Environmental Center here at DC Everest as the naturalist.
My first question for you is how would the Midwest environment, specifically Wisconsin's in biodiversity, be affected by warming temperatures?
So, how would the Midwest, more specifically Wisconsin, be affected by climate change and changing temperatures? There's two big things. Most of it is focused on having more earlier springs and having more intense dry periods during the summer. The biggest change that we've seen in Wisconsin is gradual temperature increases, about 2 degrees, give or take. That doesn't seem like much, but what that results in is much earlier spring, which means the snow is going to either thaw a lot sooner or will have a whole lot less. And on the other side of the spectrum, we are having more intense drought seasons in Wisconsin. Now, in Wisconsin, we do have some times where they do get dry. That's normal. The problem is it's happening more and it's happening for a lot longer. Why is the early thaw a bad thing? There's a lot of animals in Wisconsin, both plants and wildlife, that really depend on temperature in order for certain important parts of their ecology. For example, there are many migratory birds whose instincts are triggered more by temperature than time of day. Another big thing is plants. Certain plants and flowers will be triggered by temperature to start opening up their buds. The problem with that is a lot of the insects they depend on for pollination won't be back yet, which means we could be seeing a big decline that way. As far as other animal species go, particularly animals such as porcupines, the forests that they depend on, which are mostly hemlock forests, they really rely on wet, damp soils. If those soils become more hotter and drier as time goes by, those forests, which are mostly in northern Wisconsin, they can tend to suffer and dry up, which takes away a porcupine's big food supply, which means now we have species that are being affected not just by porcupines, but by the animals that hunt them, such as fishers, a porcupine's only natural predator. They might have a field day at first, but eventually they'll run out of food to eat, which will result in their populations being lower.
All right, so can you elaborate on how it would affect the Wisconsin food chain?
How would it affect the Wisconsin food chain? The thing that not a whole lot of people realize about any ecosystem, not just in Wisconsin, is that every living creature in it is tied to one another in even the smallest ways. And it's a lot more fragile than it would appear. You take away one particular prey animal, you have to think of, okay, what would happen to not only the food that that prey animal would eat, but what would also eat it in turn. One animal that's actually standing to benefit from climate change around here is actually the white-tailed deer. With snow thawing a lot earlier, that means that there's more stuff for them to browse than to eat. That has two effects. The first is their own population may explode as a result, but the other effect is that the plants that they might eat and nibble on could be getting taken out earlier, which means less food for everything else to go on. Another big thing to think about is the fish population in Wisconsin. One of the things that we're known for is our trout fishing. Trout are extremely sensitive animals. They will actually only breed within a very specific temperature range. With the temperatures rising, that range may be gone, which means now all of a sudden, not only do we have one population that's starting to get lower because they won't breed, but now everything that depends on them, which doesn't just include animals like traditionally bears, fishers, stuff like that, but the people whose livelihoods depend on those fishing, all of a sudden that source of food is gone.
So, in general, what would you say that what animals would benefit the most and those that would not benefit?
The animals that would benefit the most from the current changing climate, which to reiterate is the early thawing and early spring and the later summers, I'd say the biggest winners of that would be white-tailed deer as well as largemouth bass. Now, unlike trout, bass actually prefer those warmer temperatures, and we've actually seen a big population explosion of them as the temperatures have gotten warmer. Same thing with white-tailed deer. As far as the animals that would tend to lose out the most here, like I mentioned earlier, trout and other fish species that are temperature sensitive, those are the ones that will hurt the most, as well as animals that depend on the snow and the cover it provides to help them survive. Snowshoe hares, for example, their entire name and identity and design is based around a winter habitat. their coat changes, which would normally change to white during the winter months, becomes useless when hiding from predators. Another thing could be also said for their big predators, which are weasels. Weasels during the winter time will also change their fur coats as well, and they depend on the snow not just to help blend in, but they also serve that as their winter homes. So all of a sudden now they're stuck out in the cold, and they are much more likely to be preyed upon.
Are any of these animals, specifically more vulnerable animals, would affect us in some way that could harm us? Or even how would animals that are increasing could be harmful to us if, yeah.
Well, certainly these wildlife species could both harm and benefit us depending on which ones you're talking about. Like I mentioned earlier, fishing makes up an enormous part of Wisconsin's economy. So if we have less fish to go around, that's a lot of less money that people aren't pouring in to help pay for natural programs such as restoration projects, wildlife preservation, and so on. White-tailed deer, on the other hand, we could potentially see an expansion of a hunting season if the population tends to grow. But on the other side, we could see hunting seasons be reduced for other animals that tend to prey on them. For example, the wolf population, which has controversially been lifted and unlifted several times over the past few years. As of the recording of this, that ban has been lifted, which means we could potentially be seeing wolf hunts. If that were the case, you may see an increase in bag limits, or you may not. But as far as big impact is concerned, those are mostly what we're looking at. But not just wildlife are being impacted. We have plant species as well. A lot of people tend to overlook how much insects in particular will be affecting crops in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a very big agricultural base. If we see declines in insect populations due to either extreme temperatures or perhaps they're just not making it this far due to temperature changes, not only could we see wild flora go downhill, but we could also see a food shortage as a result. I would like to stress though, we haven't reached that point yet. We are not going to be seeing a food shortage soon, but if things continue to change at the current rate, we may start to see a gradual decline. But as of right now, we're more likely to see these trends in more wildlife populations, not so much in humans.
So by 2021, how would the Midwest environment be impacted?
20 on 100. Well, once again, I'd like to reiterate that a lot of this is based on what information we have as far as speculation goes. This is obviously a prediction, and predictions can often go awry. But if we were to look that far in the head, the numbers that I've seen, I recently looked at a study that was done in 2011, which projected that by the year 2050, we'd be looking at a temperature increase in the state between 6 to 11 degrees. Unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot of models that will usually predict 100 years into the future, just because climate can change so quickly. But if we were to go based off of that study, and most seem to be predicting right within that range, we can probably expect Wisconsin temperatures to increase between 12 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit if that particular model holds. Now, as for what that will do to our ecosystem and potentially our economy, think of back to what I said earlier about the certain species that were affected. We can expect to see a much greater impact, and with temperature changes that drastic over so short a period of time, we can expect other species to be nailed by that as well. Not just creatures who are temperature sensitive, but creatures you wouldn't necessarily think of. Think, for example, animals that hibernate, such as bears or woodchucks. All of a sudden, the fat buildup that they have becomes useless during the winter months, which could lead to a big detriment on their part. The big reason why climate change is so hard on wildlife and is for people is that all wildlife is defined by its ability to react and adapt to their environment. That's what evolution is at the end of the day. Now, in a normal situation, the planet's temperature would be eventually changing, and who knows, one day we might in fact do have a period where our temperatures could get this high. The problem is the environment is changing faster than these animals can adapt to it.